I woke up that morning hoping for something small, something soft, maybe a cup of tea brought to my bedside, maybe just a kiss on the cheek or a whispered, "Happy birthday" that felt like it mattered. I didn't want a party. At 74, I've long given up on candles and streamers. All I wanted was to feel seen. But instead I got his voice sharp as chipped glass, commenting from the kitchen, while scrolling through his phone. "You know," he said between mouthfuls of toast, "you're just basic." No context, no smile, just a flat statement like he was reading off a grocery list. I blinked, thinking I'd misheard. But then he looked up at me with that blank, casual shrug he gives when he's already decided a conversation isn't worth revisiting. Basic. That word clanged around inside me like a loose pan dropped on the tile. It wasn't the first time he'd said something cruel, but this time it was different. Maybe because it was my birthday. Maybe because I'd worn my favorite pink cardigan and made the cinnamon scones he always liked. Maybe because I had dared quietly, desperately to want something that day. A moment of closeness, a crumb of appreciation. And instead I got basic. A word that flattened me like I was no more than plain wallpaper. Harmless, dull, forgettable. I didn't respond. I just stood there holding the plate of warm scones like an offering he'd already rejected. The butter melted, the scent filled the room, but none of it softened the moment. He was already moving on, reading the news aloud as if his words hadn't gutted me. He talked about stock prices and somebody's retirement scandal. I just nodded, sat down and pretended my tea didn't taste like ashes. The rest of the morning passed with that slow ache that comes when you realize someone doesn't even see you as worth hurting intentionally. The worst pain, I think, is the kind that isn't even meant to be cruel. It's the kind that leaks out casually from someone who's just stopped seeing you as anything at all. I looked around the kitchen. The table I had polished for years, the calendar on the wall with everyone's appointments and reminders written in my careful hand, the vase of fading daisies I had arranged 2 days ago. All of it felt like background noise, like I was just a quiet stagehand in their show. Later that afternoon, the kids came over. They didn't bring a cake. My daughter brought over leftover lasagna and handed it to me, like she was doing me a favor. My son scrolled through his phone most of the time, chuckling at something on a screen I wasn't invited to see. At some point, my husband repeated his line, "You know what I told her this morning? She's just basic." And they laughed, not loudly, just that dismissive, breathy chuckle that says it's true and it's not worth arguing. I laughed too, or tried to. The sound caught in my throat, like I'd inhaled dust. I felt my lips stretch into a smile I didn't recognize. I was humoring them, again, just like I had humored him when he stopped holding my hand in public, when he called my hobbies old lady nonsense, when he forgot the story of how we met and didn't bother asking again. But something shifted inside me that evening, something I didn't recognize yet. It was small, like the first crack in an old teacup. You don't notice it at first, but you stop trusting it. You set it aside just in case. And maybe somewhere in that moment, surrounded by people who thought I was invisible enough to mock, I began to stop trusting the life I'd built for them. I cleared the plates. I poured tea no one drank. I watched the clock move slowly toward a bedtime that would come with silence, not intimacy. I lay in bed next to the man who once swore I was the most remarkable woman he'd ever known. He turned away from me. I watched the curve of his back and wondered how many years I had spent being basic in his eyes without ever realizing it. Or worse, maybe I had realized, and I had just learned to accept it. But this time the word stayed with me, not like a scar, no more like a seed, a hard little kernel of discomfort that wouldn't dissolve. It sat in the center of my chest and whispered questions I wasn't ready to answer. And as the hours passed, I lay awake and listened to the wind tapping the windows, the old heater humming its tune, and my own breath slow, stubborn, steady. I was still here, and for the first time in a long time I began to wonder what here could mean, if it wasn't with them. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always quiet, careful, invisible. There was a time when I danced barefoot on hardwood floors, when I wore lipstick just to go to the grocery store, when I sang along to old Motown songs while folding laundry and pretended the broom was a microphone. I remember laughing loud, ugly, unfiltered laughter until my stomach hurt and my eyes welled with joy. I remember being adored. I remember being seen. He used to call me Firecracker. That was back when our love was still young and sharp before it dulled into something that only sparked in arguments. I remember the way he looked at me when we first met, like I was something unexpected. He'd said I had a mind that wouldn't sit still and a heart too big for my own good. He loved that I cried during commercials and got worked up about small injustices, like a neighbor's dog being left in the cold. He used to say I was too much, but back then it was a compliment. But slowly, gently, the world eroded that version of me. Not all at once. It never happens like that. It's not a thunderclap, it's a slow leak. 1,000 small compromises made in the name of love, and then comfort, and then just plain survival. I folded away pieces of myself like old sweaters no longer in season. At first it was harmless. I stopped wearing bright colors because he said they made me look like a candy wrapper. I quit my book club because he complained about the nights I was gone. I muted my opinions at dinner parties because he rolled his eyes when I disagreed with him in front of friends. The changes were so gradual, I didn't even feel them happening. It was like watching the tide pull away sand from beneath your feet. You don't realize how much is gone until you feel yourself sinking. I became smaller, softer, less noticeable. I convinced myself it was maturity, that I was growing into something more refined, more stable. But now I see it clearly. I wasn't evolving. I was erasing. I kept a photo in the back of my closet, me at 30, holding our first child, cheeks, flushed hair wild from the wind, laughing so hard you could see the joy in my teeth. I used to look at that photo and think she had no idea what was coming, not in bitterness, but in sadness. That woman thought love would always feel like that bold, safe electric. She didn't know how much of herself she would trade away for peace, for quiet, for the illusion of being cherished. And it wasn't just my husband. The children followed suit. They learned by watching. They saw how I yielded, how I kept the house running, without complaint, how I never asked for much. I taught them without meaning to that I was someone who served, someone who existed only in the background. I was the soft place to land the fixer of forgotten birthdays, the finder of lost things, the cook, the cleaner, the organizer, the peacemaker. I was never the celebrated one, never the honored one. And yet I loved them fiercely, unapologetically. I didn't need parades. I just needed to feel like I mattered beyond my usefulness. But over the years, love became a job, a duty, and I became a ghost wearing an apron. I started forgetting who I was when no one was asking me for something. I'd catch myself staring into space after they left the house, wondering what I even liked anymore. Not what I used to like, what I still liked, what stirred me, what filled me. And often I came up empty. Sometimes I'd try to reclaim little pieces. I bought myself a new shade of lipstick, once a bold plum color. I wore it to dinner, and he frowned, said it looked a bit much. I never wore it again. Another time I signed up for a watercolor class. I was so excited I couldn't sleep the night before. But when I told him, he asked who would pick up his dry cleaning while I was off playing with paint. I canceled. I want to be clear. It wasn't abuse in the way people think of it. He didn't hit me. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. No, it was softer than that, more insidious. It was a long, slow forgetting, a reshaping, a quiet kind of control that wore the mask of normalcy. And I let it happen because I thought that's what marriage was. Give and take, compromise, sacrifice. Until one day I realized I had given everything and taken nothing back. Now when I walk past the mirror, I sometimes see her, the woman I used to be. She's not gone, just buried. Her eyes are still there under the tired ones. Her voice still whispers when no one else is talking over her, and lately she's been growing louder. That birthday morning didn't just sting because he called me basic. It shattered something. Not because I hadn't heard worse, but because that morning I remembered. I remembered who I used to be, and I knew with a strange clarity that she didn't deserve to disappear like this. And when you remember yourself, even just a glimpse, it's like finding a photograph you thought you lost forever. You hold it carefully, you stare, and you start to wonder if maybe it's not too late to go looking for her again. It always starts with little things, doesn't it? Tiny comments dressed up as jokes, smirks disguised as harmless observations. I didn't notice it at first, not really. When he teased me for collecting teacups, I laughed along. You and your dusty little cups, he'd say, flipping through the mail, not even looking at them. I thought he meant it playfully, that maybe he didn't understand how each one carried a memory. The blue and white one from our honeymoon, the delicate gold-rimmed one from the flea market where we spent an entire Saturday, the one our daughter gave me after her first paycheck. But to him they were clutter. To me they were time capsules. He never asked. My floral blouses, another favorite target. You look like a couch, he said once, when I wore my soft pink one with tiny daisies. I remember pausing at the mirror that morning, smoothing the fabric, and smiling to myself. It had made me feel pretty young, even whimsical. But his words landed like static in a quiet room, sharp and grating. After that, I wore more gray, less color. I told myself it was more mature, but really I was just trying not to be laughed at. The teas I ordered online, 2 loose leaf blends with names like Lavender Sunset and Citrus Morning. They made me happy, made the house smell like something from a dream. But he wrinkled his nose and called it perfumed dirt. He said real tea came in a box and cost less than $5. So I stopped ordering them. I drank the dull stuff. Black tea, no sugar, functional, flavorless, like so many of the choices I began to make. He made fun of my books too, said I only read weepy woman stories. I remember hiding a novel behind a magazine once, embarrassed to be seen reading it in bed, as if I was doing something shameful. The woman he met had dreams of being a writer. She kept journals, scribbled ideas on napkins, underlined poetry, with trembling reverence. But slowly his voice became louder than mine. His judgment wrapped itself around me like smoke. Hard to see, hard to escape, but suffocating just the same. Even the way I decorated the house was up for mockery. My crocheted throws, the embroidered pillows, the dried lavender in the hallway. He called it old lady decor. Funny, because when we first moved in, he said he loved how I made a house feel like a home, but I suppose over time, home stopped needing to feel like mine. It wasn't just him either. The children picked up his tone like it was part of the air. Mom and her weird herbal stuff, they'd say, when I suggested ginger for a cold. Don't mind her, she reads those sad books when I offered a quote I thought might help. At first, I tried to laugh with them. I didn't want to be the sensitive one. But inside something wilted, every time they giggled at a part of me I'd once loved. I used to find joy in such small, beautiful things, lighting candles before dinner, arranging wildflowers, playing classical music on Sunday mornings. I thought those rituals made life softer, warmer, more meaningful. But over the years, I stopped doing them. I didn't even notice it happen. One by one, they vanished. Not because I didn't love them, but because it hurt to love something that was always ridiculed. And somewhere along the way, I convinced myself they were right, that I was silly, that I was overly sentimental, that my pleasures were outdated, excessive, pointless. I began to believe that the things that made me feel most like myself were the very things that made me worthy of ridicule. But there's something I've learned in this late season of life. The smallest things can be the strongest mirrors. A chipped teacup, a soft blouse, a flickering candle. They're not just objects, they're fragments of identity. And when someone mocks them enough, what they're really doing is carving away at your sense of self. I remember one evening just a few weeks before my birthday, I made myself a cup of that old rose-hip tea I'd hidden away in the back of the pantry. The sun was setting. The house was quiet. I lit a candle, just one. I curled up with a book I'd always meant to finish, and for a moment, it felt like I was visiting myself in secret, like I had become my own guest. I sipped slowly, listening to the clock tick, and I swear I almost cried. Not because I was sad exactly, but because it felt like finding an old friend and realizing how long it had been since you'd spoken. He came in from the den halfway through my chapter and wrinkled his nose. "What's that smell?" he asked. "It's like a flower shop in here." I said nothing. I marked my page. I blew out the candle. I went to bed early. But I didn't forget how that moment felt. I carried it with me like a pebble in my pocket. It didn't make a sound, but it was always there, reminding me that I still existed even if no one else noticed. And maybe, just maybe, that pebble would one day be the first stone in something new, something not basic, but beautiful, something entirely mine. There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful, not the kind that wraps around you like a blanket, but the kind that chokes. I didn't wake up one day and decide to stop speaking up. It was quieter than that, slower, like watching color drain from a photograph, one shade at a time. I used to have opinions. I used to argue, push back, laugh too loudly, ask too many questions. I remember being told I was too much by more than one person in my life. But in those early years, he said he loved that about me, said I had spirit, said I kept him on his toes. But somewhere down the line, that same spirit became inconvenient. I began to notice how he sighed when I corrected him in conversation, how he'd shake his head when I voiced a concern at the dinner table. "You're overthinking again," he'd say, or "just let it go." At first I tried to explain myself, to stand my ground, but after too many conversations that ended in eye rolls or silence, I started pulling back. I told myself it wasn't worth the energy. I convinced myself it was better to be agreeable, to keep the peace, to be the glue. But glue dries. It stiffens. It cracks. And before I knew it, I was sitting through dinners, nodding along to opinions I didn't share, watching movies I didn't like, eating meals I hadn't chosen. I started using phrases like "I don't mind," and "whatever you prefer," so often that they no longer felt like choices. They felt like scripts. The kids noticed too. They'd talk over me, interrupt, change the subject before I'd finished a sentence. And I let them. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd trained them to believe my voice was background noise. Even when I was right, even when I knew I was right, I stayed quiet. It was easier than defending myself in a room that wasn't listening. Sometimes I'd try to test the waters. I'd suggest a new recipe, mention a place I wanted to visit, hint at something I'd like to try. He'd brush it off, or worse, laugh. "That's not really your thing," he'd say, as if he knew me better than I did, as if I needed permission to change. But change was happening, quietly, in the spaces between all the things I didn't say, in the moments when I bit my tongue, smiled politely, and waited for someone to remember I had a voice. I stopped singing in the kitchen. I stopped journaling. I stopped answering questions with more than 5 words. It became easier to be silent than to be dismissed. There was one day I remember vividly. We were at a family gathering and someone made a joke at my expense, something about how I always hover and micromanage. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but something in me curled inward. And when I tried to speak up and say, "I'm just trying to help," no one heard me. The conversation had already moved on. I sat there holding my paper plate, nodding along while my inside screamed. Not because of what they said, but because it didn't surprise me. I had become the family wallpaper, pleasant, predictable, always there, but rarely noticed. They loved what I did, not who I was. They loved the meals, the reminders, the folded laundry, the gentle nudges that kept birthdays from being forgotten. But not the woman who carried all of that. Not the woman with thoughts and needs and stories they didn't ask to hear. It's a peculiar grief mourning the parts of yourself that are still technically alive. The dreams you deferred so long ago, they feel like fiction. The hobbies you gave up because no one shared them with you. The words you swallowed so often they settled in your chest like stones. And still somehow I was expected to smile, to show up, to serve. And I did. I kept serving, because I didn't know what else to do. Because somewhere along the way I confused silence with strength. I thought being unbothered meant being wise. But it wasn't wisdom. It was fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of being left. Fear of discovering that if I did speak up, no one would stay to hear it. But there was one place I still spoke freely inside my head. I'd narrate my days in full sentences, compose replies I never said aloud. I'd imagine conversations where I was bold and brilliant and heard. Sometimes I'd whisper to myself in the mirror just to remember what my voice sounded like when no one was interrupting. And lately those whispers have grown louder. They're less like echoes and more like declarations, not angry, not loud, but firm, steady, certain. Because silence doesn't protect you. It buries you. And after all these years, I'm beginning to realize that I've spent too much time underground. I deserve to hear my own voice again, even if it shakes, even if it makes people uncomfortable, even if it means tearing apart the version of myself they've grown so comfortable with. Because comfort isn't the same as love, and peace isn't the same as silence. It was a Sunday evening when I saw it most clearly, not just in him, but in them. We were sitting at the long oak dining table, the one I'd polished every week for over 40 years. It was crowded with dishes I had cooked: rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes with roasted garlic, a cucumber salad with dill, and my old-fashioned peach cobbler cooling by the window. The scent filled the house. Warm, familiar, the way home is supposed to feel. I'd spent all afternoon preparing it. Not because anyone asked me to, no one had, but because I wanted to keep the rhythm of our family intact, even if I was the only one still dancing to it. The children arrived with that distracted energy they always had, now phones in hand, conversations trailing off mid-thought, one eye always on something digital. My daughter dropped her purse on the counter and headed straight for the fridge, bypassing me entirely. My son gave me a quick peck on the cheek, muttered, "Hey, Ma," then started complaining about traffic. No one asked how I was. No one noticed I was wearing a new blouse. No one thanked me for the food. And then, somewhere between passing the butter and refilling the water glasses, he said it again. The word, casually, like it was funny. "I told your mother this morning she's just basic," he said, chuckling as he reached for another spoonful of potatoes. The children laughed. Not cruelly, not viciously, just lightly, carelessly, as if I were in on the joke, as if the joke wasn't about me. My daughter smirked. "Oh, come on, Mom, you do love your little routines," my son added. "You make the same 3 meals, wear the same sweaters, watch the same shows. It's kind of your thing." I smiled, or at least I think I did. I remember the corners of my mouth moving, but it felt mechanical, like muscle memory, not emotion. I nodded along. I even made a light comment back, something about how at least my cooking was consistently good. They laughed again. But this time I heard it differently. I heard it clearly. I excused myself to the kitchen to grab a serving spoon I didn't need. I stood at the sink and watched the cobbler cooling by the window. The glass fogged slightly with the warmth. I looked down at my hands, wrinkled soft, a little shaky. Hands that had bandaged scraped knees, packed lunches, braided hair, folded towels, written notes in lunchboxes, and once clutched a wedding bouquet like it was a promise. And they laughed at me. Not out of malice. That would have been easier. They laughed out of familiarity. They laughed because they saw me the way he did, small, predictable background. They loved me, I think, but they didn't respect me. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. I stood there for a moment longer, listening to their voices, talking about work, about television, about things that didn't include me. My husband told a story I'd heard 100 times. They laughed again. I wiped my hands on a towel and returned to the table. I watched them, my family, my blood, my life's work, the ones I'd poured myself into completely. And for the first time, I didn't feel pride. I didn't feel love. I felt empty, not angry, not heartbroken, just tired. Tired in a way that seeps into the bones. A weariness that made me want to sit down in a dark room and just stop moving. After dinner, they left quickly, like they always do now. My daughter hugged me lightly, already checking her phone. My son said, "Thanks, Ma," and was gone before the door closed. My husband turned on the game in the living room and left the dishes for me. I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by crumbs and quiet. I washed each plate slowly, deliberately, like I was performing a ritual. And maybe I was. A funeral for the woman I had been. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. But something cracked. A thin, subtle fissure down the center of my chest. I could feel it. And once something cracks, it doesn't take much for it to split wide open. I sat at the table alone, in front of a half-eaten pie, and thought, they don't see me. Not really. They see what I do not, who I am. And if they couldn't see me when I was right in front of them, wearing my best blouse, offering them the warmth of my table and the labor of my hands, then maybe they never would. I looked around the house, the furniture I had picked, the curtains I'd sewn, the photographs I'd framed, and it hit me quietly, fiercely. This house isn't mine anymore. It's theirs. I just live in it. But not for much longer. After they left that night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wandered the house, not to tidy, not to straighten cushions or wipe crumbs from countertops, but just to look, to observe, to see what they saw, what I had allowed to become my world. The lights were low, casting long shadows over the familiar landscape of my life. I walked slowly barefoot, letting the coolness of the tile kiss the bottoms of my feet. The house creaked in that way old houses do, like it was sighing with me. The living room still had the same brown couch we'd argued about years ago. He insisted on leather, I wanted fabric. I gave in. I always gave in. The coffee table was scarred with rings from mugs no one bothered to use coasters for, though I'd asked 100 times. The rug I had once loved, now threadbare and dull, lay like a faded memory beneath it all. My eyes caught the bookshelf, crowded with his mystery novels, business biographies, and golf magazines. None of my favorite books were there. They were upstairs, tucked into a dusty box in the back of the closet. In the hallway, the family photos marched across the walls like a shrine. Smiling faces posed moments curated proof of a happiness we once chased. The children, as toddlers, then teens, then young adults. Family vacations, birthdays. But none of them showed me. Not really. I was there, yes, in the background, holding a cake, herding the group, adjusting a crooked tie. Always the one behind the moment, never the subject of it. I tried to remember the last time someone took a photo of me, not because I asked, not because it was obligatory, but because they saw me and wanted to remember. I moved into the dining room and touched the table's edge worn smooth by decades of elbows, arguments, laughter, and routine. I remembered the nights I stayed up late, sewing Halloween costumes at this very spot, the years I wrapped Christmas presents alone, so everyone else could be surprised the afternoons I sat with bills, spread out like a puzzle, trying to stretch too little money across too many needs. The kitchen, still fragrant with the lingering scent of baked peaches, was quiet now. I opened a cabinet and stared at the stacks of plates, all white, all uniform. We'd bought them when the kids were teenagers. He said it was time to get rid of the girly dishes I loved. I missed the old ones, the ones with the chipped roses and mismatched colors. I had chosen those with care back when my taste still counted for something, back when my voice still had a place. I made my way upstairs, the carpet soft beneath my steps, the handrail polished from years of being gripped during sleepy climbs and quiet descents. The bedrooms were still the air heavy with memories. I peeked into the guest room, now cluttered with forgotten things, boxes a treadmill no one used, clothes destined for donation. It used to be our daughter's room, once full of posters and perfume and teenage drama. Now it was a graveyard of what no longer fit. And then I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, our bedroom. But it hadn't felt like mine in years. The bed was too big, the sheets too cold on my side. His side was always messy, mine, always neat. A line drawn down the middle, invisible but undeniable. I looked at the nightstand. His held books, glasses, phone chargers. Mine held a single lavender sachet and an old alarm clock I hadn't needed in ages. I opened my drawer. It was nearly empty. Some lotion, a pair of reading glasses, a dried flower from a bouquet long gone. Nothing personal, nothing secret, nothing sacred. There was no corner of that house that felt like mine anymore. It was a house I'd cleaned, maintained, nurtured, and yet somehow it had stopped belonging to me. I was the caretaker, the background, the afterthought. It hit me like a wave. This house, once my dream, had become my prison. Decorated not with my taste, but with compromise. Organized not for my comfort, but for their convenience. I sat at the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle around me like dust. I realized I hadn't bought anything just for myself in years. Not a chair, not a lamp, not even a framed photo. Every item had been filtered through someone else's needs, someone else's eye. I had disappeared into the furniture, become part of the walls. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. I thought about every time I'd bitten my tongue, every time I'd rearranged myself to be less of a burden. I thought about the sound of their laughter at my expense. I thought about the word basic and how it had nestled into the crevices of my mind like mold. And then something curious happened. I pictured myself in a different house, smaller, sunlit, a yellow kettle on the stove, a stack of books on a chair I actually liked. Quiet not because no one was speaking, but because the air was mine, my rhythm, my space. It felt impossible, and yet it also felt like oxygen. I looked around the room again and saw it for what it was, a life I had built and was no longer allowed to live in. And in that moment, I stopped being afraid of the idea of leaving. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel triumphant. But I did feel awake. And I thought, what would happen if I stopped asking to be seen and started seeing myself? The garden was always mine, even when the rest of the house felt like it belonged to someone else. It was the one place no one really paid attention to, so I could do what I pleased. I planted what I liked, moved things without consulting anyone, trimmed, watered, rearranged. The dirt didn't argue. The flowers didn't judge. I didn't have to ask for permission to bloom something beautiful. It was quiet out there, in a way that didn't sting, and maybe that's why I always returned to it when the walls inside grew too loud with silence. That morning, after another sleepless night, I stepped outside just after dawn. The grass was still damp with dew, the sun just beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the yard. I wore my robe and slippers, clutching a mug of tea no one else liked, the lavender rosehip, one steeped strong and sweet. I walked slowly between the flower beds. The roses had started to wilt. The lilies were bending under their own weight. I crouched near the marigolds and noticed the first signs of mildew on their leaves. I should have trimmed them days ago, but I hadn't. Not because I forgot, because I was tired of tending things no one noticed, tired of beauty that was invisible to everyone but me. And yet, as I knelt there, something in the stillness spoke to me. I saw her again, her, the woman I had been. Not as a ghost, not as a regret, but as a shadow resting beside me in the dirt. I could almost feel her breath, see her hands beside mine. She wasn't gone, just quiet, just buried, like bulbs under frozen earth, waiting for spring. I rose and walked over to the patio doors, catching my reflection in the glass, soft-fogged but undeniable. An old woman. Yes. Lines etched deep around her mouth and eyes, hair a little frizzier than she'd like, robe slightly stained from too many mornings in the same kitchen. But the eyes, they were clear. They were awake. And I said something aloud to the reflection. You are not basic. The words came out hoarse, cracked almost like a whisper, but they startled me. Not because I didn't believe them, because I did. And I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd spoken kindly to myself, not just in my head, out loud, as if I deserved to hear it in the open air. I stood there, holding my tea, watching the woman in the glass. I thought about how long she had waited for someone to choose her, to say, you matter, to say, your softness is not weakness, to say, your simplicity is sacred. And I realized something. Maybe the reason it hurt so much when they called me basic is because I had finally begun to cherish the parts of myself they dismissed. The simple meals, the warm sweaters, the same old movies, the tiny rituals, the floral blouses and garden journals. They weren't evidence of a faded life, they were evidence of a life lived with care. That morning I took a small notebook from the junk drawer and started writing. Not a list, not a plan, just fragments, feelings, what I missed, what I wanted. A room with yellow curtains, books by the bed, a chair that creaks like an old friend, silence that feels safe. I didn't know what I was building, only that it felt like the beginning of something, not a fantasy, not a tantrum, a blueprint. Later that afternoon, he came outside while I was trimming the roses. He glanced around and said, "You always waste so much time on these." I didn't answer. I just kept pruning. He lingered a moment longer, then went back inside, and I felt it again, that curious flicker of detachment. Not pain, not rage, just release. I looked down at my hands, now covered in soil. I thought about how many things those hands had created. Meals, warmth, order, beauty. And I thought if I could shape life for everyone else, maybe I could shape one for myself too, one where no one laughed at my garden, one where the only person I needed permission from was already looking back at me through the glass. And for the first time, the idea of a different life didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a door, one that had always been there, locked from the inside, waiting. You don't notice invisibility all at once. It arrives gradually like fog creeping in through an open window. At first you brush it off. You assume everyone's just tired, distracted, busy. You tell yourself it's a phase. You convince yourself it doesn't matter. Until one day you're sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that's gone cold, and you realize no one said your name in 2 days, not even once. That day started like any other. He was in the den watching something with the volume too loud. The kids had their own lives. No calls, no check-ins, no, "How are you?" "Mom, I spent the morning cleaning the pantry, throwing away expired cans, wiping shelves that no one else would ever notice were clean. I folded towels no one would thank me for, matched socks that didn't belong to me. I boiled eggs for a salad no one would eat." And it hit me sometime around lunch, as I stood by the sink eating a piece of toast with my hands I could disappear, and no one would notice. Not for hours, maybe days. They'd get hungry eventually. They'd run out of clean shirts. But until something broke, until something was missing, they wouldn't come looking. It wasn't that they didn't love me. I know they did in their own muted, automatic ways. It's that they'd grown so used to me being there, to me doing everything, that they stopped thinking of me as a person. I was a presence, not a person. A service, a background hum, always available, always expected. I once read that when people stop seeing you, it's not because you've disappeared, it's because they've stopped looking. And I think that's what had happened. They'd stopped looking, not just with their eyes, but with their hearts. I was part of the house like the thermostat or the coat rack, always there, always useful, never noticed. Even conversations had become one-sided. My husband talked at me, not with me. He gave me updates, not invitations. "I'll be late Tuesday. Don't forget the dry cleaning. They're rerouting the commute again." And I'd nod, file it away, adjust. That was my role. The adjuster, the rememberer, the soft, silent buffer between their lives and any form of inconvenience. The children, too, reached out only when they needed something. Help with the kids, help with the taxes, help finding a missing document from years ago that only I would have kept. And I always came through, always, even when it hurt, even when I was tired, because that's what mothers do. That's what wives do. That's what good women do. But is it goodness if it erases you? I started testing it quietly. I stopped doing small things to see if anyone noticed. I left the mail unopened. No one mentioned it. I didn't refill the hand soap in the bathroom. They used water and walked away. I didn't restock the cereal. They just bought takeout and shrugged. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't punishment. It was curiosity. A slow, aching experiment in whether my presence was tied only to my usefulness. And the answer came clear as glass it was. That realization didn't break me. It didn't even make me cry. It just clarified something I'd long been too afraid to admit. They loved what I gave, not who I was. And the moment I stopped giving, the moment I stopped spinning the plates, the music stopped too. That night I lit a candle in the hallway. Just one. A small ritual I used to love. I sat beside it on the floor, leaned my back against the wall, and let the flickering light dance across my hands. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just watched. and for a moment it felt like I was visiting a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. The quiet girl who used to write poems in college, the one who once dreamed of running a bookstore by the sea. She was still there, not gone, just folded up, neatly tucked away like a favorite blouse pushed to the back of a drawer. I closed my eyes and whispered a simple question. What would it look like to live just for me? And in the darkness behind my eyelids, an answer began to form, not as a sentence, but as a feeling. Spacious, light, uncluttered. A life where I didn't have to apologize for wanting more. A life where I didn't have to earn rest or affection or solitude. A life where my value wasn't measured by how well I served others, but how deeply I honored myself. The invisibility hadn't happened overnight. But that night, sitting beside a tiny candle and my own breath, I began the slow and sacred process of becoming visible again. Not to them, to me. And once I could see myself, everything else began to change. It was a Wednesday, the kind of day no one remembers. Overcast sky, quiet air, nothing remarkable on the calendar. I had gone through the motions like always, scrambled eggs, made the bed swept, the porch, watered the houseplants, and listened to the same low muttering of the news drifting from the living room. He was in his recliner, half listening, half napping, grumbling now and then about politics or the price of milk. I stood in the kitchen wiping down the counter for the third time, though it wasn't dirty, just wiping to stay in motion. Because if I stood still too long, something inside me would ache. That's when it happened. Not a bang, not a breakdown, just a moment so still and so quiet it rang like a bell in my chest. I was folding a pair of his socks, gray-worn, threadbare at the heel, and I paused. I looked down at them in my hands, and the question came soft and steady. Is this how the rest of your life will feel? I don't know where the voice came from. Maybe it was the woman I used to be. Maybe it was the one I was becoming. But it didn't sound angry. It sounded calm, like truth finally having its turn to speak. I held those socks like they were a decision, and slowly, methodically, I placed them on the stack, smoothed the pile, and straightened my back. That's when I knew. I was going to sell the house. The thought didn't terrify me. It didn't even surprise me. It fit inside me like something I'd known for a long time, but hadn't dared to touch, like a dress I'd kept at the back of the closet waiting for the right occasion. And suddenly the occasion had arrived. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about making a statement. It was about reclaiming something that had slowly been drained from me, my choice. For too long I had lived in a house that no longer reflected me, surrounded by people who mistook my endurance for contentment. I had been useful, dependable, invisible, but never free. I knew what selling the house would mean. It would unsettle them. It would confuse them. They would call me dramatic, emotional, selfish even. But I also knew this: not one of them had ever asked me if I was happy here. Not once. They assumed I was fine because I kept moving, because I smiled, because I didn't complain. But I had been disappearing inch by inch. And that day, standing in my own kitchen with a dish towel over my shoulder and a lifetime of sacrifice humming in my bones, I decided I was done asking for space in a house I had built. I made no announcement. I didn't storm out or cry into my tea. I simply walked upstairs, opened the drawer where we kept the paperwork, and pulled out the old file marked Property Deed. My hands didn't shake. I felt strangely calm, like something sacred was unfolding exactly on time. That afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table and Googled real estate agents. I chose one with a kind smile and warm eyes in her photo, someone who looked like she would understand. I sent the message, short, direct. I'm looking to sell my home. Please contact me for a consultation. I closed the laptop and stood up. The floor felt steadier beneath my feet, as though the very bones of the house had shifted. Not in protest, almost in relief, as if it too was tired of pretending. That night I cooked dinner like always. He didn't notice anything different. He ate, watched television, and went to bed with the same routine, the same indifference. And I watched him not with malice, but with clarity. He was a man who had grown comfortable in a life I no longer recognized, a man who didn't mean to harm me, but did slowly, thoughtlessly, with every assumption that I would always be there. And maybe I had been for far too long. But something had shifted, something irrevocable. I was no longer asking for my life back. I was taking it. That night, as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom watching him sleep, I whispered, not to him, but to myself, "You're not too late." And for the first time in years, I believed it. The first time I met with the realtor, I told him I was just exploring options. That was the lie I used to feel safe. But inside, I already knew. I wasn't exploring. I was choosing. Slowly, deliberately, in the way only someone invisible learns to do, without fanfare, without warning. I had spent a lifetime preparing everyone else's path. This one, finally, was mine. I wore a beige coat and a blue scarf he hadn't noticed in years. I walked to the appointment instead of driving. I didn't want the car to be gone too long. I had rehearsed what I'd say if anyone asked, but no one did. Not that day. Not any day. They were all too busy with their own screens, their own noise, their own lives, that moved around me like weather systems I couldn't touch. The realtor's office was bright, too bright at first. I sat across from her. Yes, her, not him. I changed my mind at the last minute. Something in me knew I needed someone who might understand. Her name was Clarice. She had gray, streaked hair and a warm voice. I liked her immediately. She asked questions gently. How long had I lived there? What kind of neighborhood was it? Had I done any recent renovations, and answered everything with calm precision, though inside my hands trembled slightly beneath the table, not from fear, from release. Like untying a knot that had lived in my chest so long I'd forgotten it was there. When she asked why I wanted to sell, I smiled softly and said, I just want something smaller, something that feels like mine. She nodded. She didn't press. That alone made me feel seen. I returned home that afternoon with a folder tucked under my arm and a new thought blooming quietly in the back of my mind. They don't have to know. Not yet. That thought gave me more strength than I expected. It became a secret I carried in my chest, like a pearl. Smooth, sacred mine. I began looking at the house through different eyes, not the eyes of the caretaker, or the peacemaker, or the invisible wife, but the eyes of someone letting go. I started clearing drawers one at a time. The junk drawer in the hallway was first. I threw out broken pens, expired coupons, old batteries that had long given up. Then came the linen closet. I folded everything, neatly put aside what I would take with me, and quietly donated what no longer served me. Each act felt small, but significant, like reclaiming square inches of my soul. When they were out of the house, at work, at the gym, running errands, I took photos, not just for the listing, but for myself, to remind myself of what this place was and what it had become. A museum of everyone else's lives. A house full of objects I'd bought, but memories I didn't recognize anymore. One afternoon, as I dusted the mantel, I picked up a framed photo from our 25th anniversary. We were standing side by side, smiling. But when I looked closely, I saw it the way I stood slightly behind him, the way his smile looked effortless and mine looked practiced. I put the photo down and took another one off the wall, just me years ago holding a birthday cake, wearing that old floral dress he used to mock. My smile was real in that one. I kept it, packed it quietly into the box labeled "For My New Place." I made lists. I researched apartments. I visited one during my grocery run, telling them I was delayed in traffic. No one noticed the extra hour. I stood in a small sunlit room with white walls and no memories, and imagined what it would feel like to wake up there alone, to brew the tea I liked, to hang the curtains I wanted, to breathe without apology. And still I said nothing. The house continued as it always had, my husband watching his shows, grumbling about things that didn't matter to me anymore. The children dropping in and out, taking what they needed, leaving without lingering. No one asked why the linen closet looked lighter. No one wondered where the guest towels had gone. No one noticed I had started eating dinner later by myself in the kitchen while they stared at their screens in the other room. And I kept going, quietly, steadily, every hidden act a declaration. I began to feel different. Not younger, not freer exactly, but realer. More myself than I had been in decades. Like I was stepping back into my own skin after years of renting space in everyone else's expectations. One evening, as I stood in the hallway folding the last of the empty boxes I'd secretly ordered, I looked around and thought, this is no longer my home. This is my exit. And then I smiled, because that smile didn't feel practiced. It felt earned. It happened in the kitchen, like so many things in our life had quietly, over cluttered counters and cooling coffee. I hadn't planned to tell him that day. Not yet. But the moment arrived on its own, uninvited and irresistible, like a tide that had risen too high to ignore. He was sitting at the kitchen table, still in his slippers, reading the news on his tablet. The same cup of black coffee beside him, half drunk. The same tangle of crumbs around his plate. I stood at the sink, rinsing out a vase that used to hold tulips. My back was to him. I could feel the silence between us, not hostile, not even strained, just hollow. I dried my hands and turned around. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't preface it with an explanation or a warning. I just said it. I've put the house on the market. He didn't look up right away. He thought he'd misheard. I watched his eyes flicker across the screen once more, before his head turned slowly. What? I've spoken to a realtor. The listing goes live next week. I said it the way you say something that's already happened. No room for bargaining. No space for doubt. He blinked, laughed. A short scoffing sound. You're joking. I'm not. He stared at me like I was a stranger, like I'd spoken in a language he didn't understand. Why would you do that? We're not moving. That's ridiculous. I am, I said. You can do what you like. The silence that followed was sharp, not because it was loud, but because he had never heard that tone in my voice before. Not anger, not sarcasm. Just certainty. Calm, heavy certainty. He pushed his chair back as if that would make the moment easier to stand in. You're being dramatic, he said. What is this, some kind of late-life crisis? No, I replied. It's a late-life awakening. He shook his head, muttered something about ungratefulness, about how everything he did was for the family, for the house, for me. I let him speak. Let him unravel. Let him flail in the storm he never thought I'd bring. He talked about money, about how it was our home, how I couldn't just decide these things on my own. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I opened a drawer, pulled out the file folder I had prepared, and placed it gently on the table in front of him. The realtor's business card, paper clipped to the top. The signed contract underneath. His name nowhere on the deed. It had always been mine since I inherited it from my aunt before we were married. He had forgotten that, or maybe he'd never really known. He sat back in his chair like the air had left the room. "You've really done this," he said quietly. I nodded, yes. He looked down at the papers, then at me. I could see the beginning of something unfamiliar behind his eyes, fear, maybe, or recognition. For the first time in years, he was truly looking at me. "What about the kids?" he asked. "What are you going to tell them?" "That I needed to make a change," I said. "That it's my life too, and I'm finally living it." He didn't respond right away, just stared at the papers like they might rewrite themselves if he blinked hard enough. I could almost hear the narrative unraveling in his mind, the version of me that would always be there. Always serve, always yield, gone. "You can't just leave," he said softer now. I looked at him, really looked. The man who had once called me firecracker. The man who had stopped asking me questions decades ago. The man who sat across from me every day without ever wondering what was behind my silence. "I'm not leaving," I said gently. "I'm returning to myself." There was nothing cruel in my voice, no bitterness, just the weight of a truth long denied. I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want revenge. I wanted freedom. And sometimes the act of claiming it looks like betrayal to those who benefit from your confinement. I stood there watching him try to make sense of it all, and I felt a strange peace settle over me. Not victory, not triumph, something quieter, something like justice. The confrontation ended, not with a shout, not with a slammed door, but with stillness. He looked down at the papers. I walked back to the sink. The vase was clean now. Empty, ready for something new. That night we didn't speak much. He stayed in the den. I sat in the bedroom and folded clothes I would soon pack. I lit a candle, played the music I liked, and for the first time in years I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I wasn't managing someone else's comfort. I was preparing for my own future, one that no longer required permission. The morning after I told him the house was still, not the kind of stillness that follows peace, but the kind that follows a storm you didn't see coming. He didn't say a word when I passed him in the hallway. I made my tea, added honey, sat in the chair by the window, the one he used to call my nonsense spot, and watched the sun rise through the trees. A sliver of gold threaded through the branches and lit the rim of my cup. I let myself savor that moment because for the first time in so long I felt like I was living a day that belonged to me. There was no turning back now. The for sale sign was on its way. Clarice had scheduled the photos. My list of what to keep had narrowed to 3 boxes. My mind was clear, and my heart. It wasn't heavy anymore. Not exactly. It felt full. Full of endings, yes, but also beginnings. A deep exhale after years of holding my breath. I started the process room by room, not just packing, but rewriting. Every drawer I opened, every closet I touched. I asked myself, is this part of the story I want to carry forward? Most of it wasn't. Most of it belonged to a version of me who said yes when she wanted to say no, who smiled when she wanted to weep, who performed motherhood and marriage like a well-rehearsed play. I had lived that story long enough. I found my wedding dress yellowed now, with time stuffed in a plastic bag in the attic. I touched the lace with something like affection, but I didn't keep it. I didn't need relics of a ceremony that had long since wilted into routine. I let it go. I let her go, the girl who thought love meant shrinking to fit someone else's shape. In the hall closet, I found my journals, old ones from before the children were born, before the house, before the silences. I sat on the floor and read page after page. I didn't cry. I smiled. I had forgotten how bright I once was, how hungry I had been for life. That version of me was still there in ink and memory, waiting patiently for her voice to be heard again. I packed those carefully. They would come with me. I moved to the kitchen where so much of my life had been lived. I gave away the matching white plates. I wrapped the chipped teacups in linen and placed them gently in a box marked mine. I stared at the spice rack and chose only the ones I loved: rosemary, cinnamon, cardamom, a tiny tin of saffron I'd never used, but always dreamed about. I would use it now, not for anyone else, just for me. In the hallway, I pulled down the family calendar. All those years of penciled birthdays, doctor's appointments, recital times, dinner plans, pages filled with everyone else's lives. I tore them away month by month until the board was bare. I stood there, with the last empty page in my hands, and I knew this was what starting over looked like. Blank space, clean beginnings, no obligations etched in ink. I wrote a short note and pinned it there in place of the calendar. It said, "This house was filled with love and labor, but the woman who made it a home is choosing herself now." I didn't tell anyone I'd written it. I didn't care if they read it or not. It wasn't for them. It was for me. A goodbye. A final gentle closing of the door. That night I burned old receipts, faded cards, apology notes I'd read over and over, through tears. I kept only what honored me. I let the rest go in the quiet crackle of a fireplace that had seen too many birthdays end in loneliness. The house had grown quieter, but not in the suffocating way it used to. It felt like a library at closing hour, still sacred, complete. He watched me from the doorway sometimes, didn't say much. I don't think he knew how to speak to this version of me, the one who no longer asked, no longer waited. He walked a little softer around me now. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was disbelief, but I didn't need an explanation. The story I had lived here had many chapters, some beautiful, some bruising, but I was the one holding the pen now, and in the margins of my memory, I began to write something new, not in sorrow, not in spite, but in quiet, deliberate liberation. And that is how I began to rewrite my life. I woke before the sun. The sky was still ink black, and the house held that rare hush that only appears in the hour just before dawn, when even the walls seem to sleep. I slipped out of bed without turning on the lamp. He didn't stir. I stood there for a moment beside the dresser, watching his silhouette in the dark, and I felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, just stillness. A strange, weightless calm, the kind that comes not from forgetting but from accepting. The night before, I'd packed the last of my things, 2 suitcases, 3 boxes, and a tote bag with the essentials: tea, my journals, my old scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender, and the framed photo of me holding that birthday cake all those years ago. I hadn't said anything to the children. I didn't need a scene. I didn't want their pleas, their bargaining, their half-hearted offers to visit more often. That wasn't what this moment was about. It was never meant to be a performance. This was my quiet revolution. I dressed slowly, comfortable slacks, and a somki cardigan, my sturdy walking shoes. I made tea in the kitchen without flipping on the overhead light, just the warm orange glow of the stove lamp. The kettle's whistle was barely audible, as if it too understood the importance of silence. I poured it into my favorite mug, the blue ceramic one with the chip at the rim, and took it to the dining table, now bare, except for a single folded note placed carefully beside a vase of dried lavender. I didn't write much, just enough to be clear. This home was once filled with love. Somewhere along the way it emptied out. I stayed as long as I could, longer than I should have. I leave now, not in anger, but in peace. M. I didn't sign my full name. I didn't need to. They would know. Or maybe they wouldn't, not right away. Maybe they'd read it, blink in confusion, and call me dramatic. But in time I hoped they'd understand. that love isn't something you earn by erasing yourself, that silence doesn't equal happiness, that being dependable isn't the same as being fulfilled. The moving truck arrived just after 6. I'd paid extra for a discreet service, no branded logos, no noise. 2 kind-faced young men knocked gently as instructed. I opened the door to the cool morning air and welcomed them in. We worked together in near silence. Box by box, they carried out the pieces of my future, my books, my paintings, the chair I loved that no one else ever sat in. They wrapped the tea set carefully. One of them smiled when he saw it. "Beautiful set," he said. I smiled back. It's been waiting a long time to be used properly. I didn't take much, just what mattered, just what belonged to me, not in name but in soul. I walked through each room one last time, not to mourn it, but to honor it. The kitchen where I had poured thousands of cups of tea, the living room where I had once danced alone to the radio, the hallway lined with family photos, so many of them, and yet so few where I was looking at the camera. I paused at each one, touched the frame, and said goodbye, not with sorrow, but with grace. Upstairs, I lingered in the bedroom doorway. He was still asleep. I could hear the soft wheeze of his breath, the same familiar rhythm I'd listened to for 47 years. I didn't wake him. There was nothing left to say in person that hadn't already been lived. Our story had run its course. I wished him no harm. I wished him clarity. I wished him silence deep enough to finally hear the absence where my presence used to be. I closed the front door gently behind me. The morning air was cool, almost sweet, a hint of dew in the breeze. I looked up at the sky and saw the first pink threads of dawn unfurling behind the rooftops. The world was waking, and so was I. The truck pulled away slowly. I sat in the front seat, hands folded in my lap, and didn't look back. Not once. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I already knew what I'd see. A house, 4 walls, a roof, familiar windows, but not a home. Not for me. Not anymore. As we drove, I watched the streets pass like pages of a book I'd finished reading. Not a tragedy. Not a fairy tale. Just a story that had run its course. I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel uncertain. I felt weightless. And when we crossed the bridge that led toward my new neighborhood, I whispered something I hadn't dared speak aloud in decades. This time I choose me. The first thing I noticed was the light. My new apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen, but the light poured in like honey every morning through the east-facing windows. I hadn't realized how starved I was for sunshine, how long I'd been living in the shadows of a house that dimmed more than it ever warmed. Here the walls were bare and white, but instead of feeling empty, they felt ready. I moved slowly at first, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to savor each decision. I picked out yellow curtains with tiny embroidered vines. Not neutral beige, not something practical. Yellow. Bright, bold, full of cheer. The kind of color that announces itself. I bought them with no one's opinion but my own. The furniture I chose was soft and worn in all the right ways. A rocking chair that creaked when I leaned back just slightly. A small bookshelf that leaned a bit to the left, as if bowing in welcome. I didn't try to match everything. I didn't decorate to impress anyone. I arranged my space the way a painter might arrange her colors, by feel, by instinct, by love. I put my teacups on open shelves, each one with a memory. I filled mason jars with dried lavender and rosemary from the garden I had once tended, the one I said goodbye to, without tears. I stacked my journals on the windowsill, where the light could touch their worn spines. I bought a little radio for music, classical in the morning, old jazz in the evenings. I started lighting a candle every night just after sunset, even if I was alone. Especially because I was alone, and I was. alone. No footsteps echoing down the hall, no muttering from the den, no demands, no passive sighs, just my own breath, my own rhythm. The silence here was not absence, it was space. For the first time in years, I had room to think, to speak aloud without being interrupted to hum, without being mocked to laugh at a memory, without explaining it. I could stay up late reading poetry, or go to bed early wrapped in flannel sheets I chose myself. I could make toast for dinner or bake bread at midnight. I made my own rules here. The children called eventually. Of course they did. The voicemails were confused at first, concerned, then slightly hurt. You didn't even tell us, one said. We could have helped another. I listened. I didn't respond right away. I wanted my silence to teach what my words never could, that I had given enough. And now I was giving to myself. Eventually I did call them back, not to explain, just to reassure. I'm safe. I'm well. I'm just living differently now. And when they asked if they could visit, I said, of course, but on my terms. My door was still open, but my boundaries were no longer invisible. As for him, he didn't call. I think pride or maybe disbelief kept him quiet. Or perhaps he was waiting for me to come back, certain it was just a phase. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't expecting anything. I had let go of the need to be understood by someone who never really listened. And in that release, I found peace. I started writing again. Just little things, fragments of thought, dreams I used to have poems about, ordinary beauty. I wrote not to be published, not to be praised, but to hear myself think. I was remembering the music of my own mind. One afternoon, I painted a canvas, just swirls of pink and ochre and violet. It looked like a storm or maybe a flower. I didn't care. I hung it above my bed. It made me smile every time I saw it. It was wild and strange and beautiful like me. And slowly, gently, life began to feel like mine again. I was not lonely. I was alone. And that was different. Loneliness is hunger. Aloneness is freedom. And here, in my little apartment with its creaky floors and golden light, I was full not of noise or duty or others' expectations, but of myself, my own quiet fullness. A richness earned not through sacrifice, but through return. Not return to a past life, not return to someone else's vision of who I should be, but return to the woman I had once been long ago, before the silencing, before the folding, before the fading, the one with a soft heart and fierce spirit, the one who loved deeply and deserved to be loved back, the one who finally remembered she didn't need permission to begin again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I walked past a boutique on my street and saw it a blouse in the window covered in bright pink peonies, loose and soft and radiant with joy. The kind of blouse he would have called too much, the kind the children would have chuckled at behind polite smiles. I stepped inside and tried it on. It fit like it had been waiting for me. I wore it out of the store and didn't look back. On the way home, a woman maybe in her 30s stopped me on the sidewalk. "You look beautiful in that," she said with genuine warmth in her voice. I smiled so wide it nearly cracked my cheeks. "Thank you," I replied. And then softer, as if to myself, "It feels like me." I wore that blouse to the market, to the cafe, to the park. I wore it while writing, while dancing in my apartment to old soul records, while drinking lavender tea in the evening light. I wore it as a banner, a quiet declaration: I am not basic. I am blooming. For years they mistook my gentleness for dullness, my simplicity for smallness. But there is nothing small about surviving invisibility. There is nothing dull about building a life from the pieces you were told to discard. There is nothing basic about a woman who chooses herself after decades of being everyone else's foundation. They had called me ordinary, but I see it now. My love was extraordinary. My patience, my care, my resilience. the beauty I brought to every room, the steadiness I offered, while the world rushed around me. They saw routines, I lived rituals. They saw predictability, I lived presence. They saw background, I was the canvas. I don't need to explain myself to anyone anymore. Not for the house I sold, not for the life I left behind, not for the space I now claim. Because I've learned something in these quiet sunlit days. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it takes the form of a chipped teacup, or a handwritten journal, or a blouse covered in flowers. Sometimes it looks like a woman drinking tea alone with her head held high. I rearranged the furniture last week just because I wanted to. I put the rocking chair by the window so I could watch the rain. I added fairy lights to the bookshelf. I started a new journal with a blue cloth cover and gold edges. On the first page I wrote, "This is the chapter where I become the author." Not the character, not the footnote, not the one who serves the plot, the author. Some nights I dream about that old house, but it's never bitter. It's quiet like visiting an old school you once loved and outgrew, a place that shaped you but could no longer hold you. I walk through the dream rooms and smile at the girl I used to be. I thank her for enduring, for keeping a flame alive under all that silence, for waiting even when she wasn't sure what she was waiting for. And now here I am, not angry, not regretful, just awake, awake in a life that feels soft and wild and entirely mine. They used to call me basic, but they were wrong. I was never basic. I was brilliant.